of this episode will be on international trade law. Let's begin by looking into why nations, or rather, let's go back to the macro level, why do we trade with each other? So, you have a very nice chapter. What did you find? What's your name?
Yes.
Coffee? Drinking coffee? No? Tell me that you drink, or you have it. You have a cow at home where you can milk the cow and drink the milk. So what you have as a solution is you go to the vendors and you buy that, right? So speaking of as to why, or when you look into the reasons as to why countries trade with each other, it's the same as why we need to buy things, why we need to trade with every necessities that we need from someone else instead of me, because you don't have the skill, you don't have the resource, you don't have those things. When you can look at what we mean by international trade in general, it's the exchange of commodities, services as well, between different nations. So what makes trade between you and the merchant, or between you and the shop owner over there, different from the trade between two nations is, of course, we're dealing with sovereign states in the case of international trade. So when we define international trade, what we say is it's a transaction of goods and services between different nations, between two or more countries. So commodities that are traded could be consumer products, goods, sometimes we think about services as a trade, where you use the service of another country because you don't have that service maybe within your own territory or for some other reason. So these international transactions, of course, are facilitated by international financial payments. So you have the involvement of either the private banks or the national banks of several states, where they all play an important role in effecting payment for the goods that you trade. So this international trade, and which is accompanied by financial payment transactions, is mainly necessitated, or because countries do not have the commodities, or they do not have everything that they need. So they need to transact with each other. They need to buy things that they don't produce and sell the things that they produce. And that's, most of the time, that's a result of a difference in the endowment of natural resources, in what they have as a resource. Some countries may be rich in oil, others are rich in minerals or in gold or any other thing. Whereas other countries have an abundant land, fertile land, which can be tilled and you can produce some agricultural products. So you identify which resources you have as a country, as a nation, and you export or you sell the things that you can produce and buy the things that you don't produce, or you do not have the natural resource that you actually need that to survive, or for the running of the country in general. So when we look at trade in this way, we may think that, or we can take it for granted that it has been accepted all the time that countries should trade with each other. But that, unfortunately, was not the case. When we go back to earlier times, probably even in some parts of our country, you may have heard of a feeling or a sentiment that the society has towards a particular group of persons. Or, so what's, for example, what's the perception? Are you all from this? From this city or from different parts of the country? from the different parts. So how does the community from where you come from perceive a particular or a person from another community in terms of not as a result of where he or she finds her lineage, but rather in terms of what he does for a living? Is there any negative connotation that you know of? Yellow? negative የሆነ ፐርሲቭ የምናደርጋቸው ወይም ኮሚኒቲው ኔጌቲቭ የሆነ ፐርሰፕሽን ያለባቸው የስራ አክቲቪቲዎች ያሉባቸው ኮሚኒቲዎች so trade ጋር ስንመጣ we had that kind of or that sense in some recorded history shows that there was a kind of perception towards traders and trading activities. So it's not always something accepted or something considered as a good thing to trade, to be a trader, to be a seller of something. Even if we need to buy those things, even if we know that we are not in a position to make everything that we need, still there was some kind of stigma towards those business persons. That's even worse when we look into trading with foreigners, or when we consider buying from or allowing a foreigner to cross a particular country's territory and sell his or her goods in the country. So the perceptions that we had in those earlier times was one of a negative thing, that no, we should not, it's not good. Or traders would, particularly foreign traders, would bring some immoral things, immoral behaviors would be introduced to our society, and the society that we consider as divine. So when you look into early writings, where there were some recorded events about, or in early Greek and in early Roman times, that was the perception that, or the debate was that they should not pay foreign trade. We are the whole country. I mean, we should not trade with non-Greeks or non-Romans because they would somehow taint the society. They would introduce some behaviors that are not accepted to the society that they have. So, especially when it comes to foreign trade, what we had was kind of an ambivalence towards accepting the trading activity, towards traders, and specifically towards foreign trade. So we have this tendency of categorizing merchants as of inferior class, or there was that kind of tendency. And then when you couple that with being an additional element of being a foreign one, what you have is a kind of no, trading with other nations is not good. That's quite different with trading with other parts of the society within the same country. Like, for example, you have a country which forms about 10 or 5 different regions. Regional kind of trading was accepted, it was okay. Yes, still there's a stigma attached towards merchants, but still that was considered as better than trading with a country which is outside of those 5 regions. Because the first one was considered as buying from our own, selling to our own, paying to our own, or receiving from our own kind of attitude. But then early writers, like Plato, for example, have acknowledged that it is necessary to trade with one another. But still, his view was not clear whether that trade, the goodness of this thing, should be extended to foreign trade as well. He accepted that, yes, it's okay to trade with your neighbors, with the person in the other region, within the same country, within the same sovereign country. But trading, this conclusion does not, or did not extend to trade with regard to or with countries outside of or to foreign trades. But then we have also other theorists who suggest that God created the sea, the geographical separation of countries, so that we can explore others, we can be able to connect with others via or traveling using the sea and so on. Mind, it has nothing to do with economics. Okay? The reason why even those, the doctrine of universal economy, that's what it used to be called, doctrine of universal economy. It's basically, it says that God created the sea, created some geographical separations, and we had the ability to make something to travel to cross the sea. So this is an indication that we should travel from one part of the world to another part of the world and interact with each other. So those things, those arguments, whether the one that says trading activity should be limited within the territory of a state, or the universal doctrine of universal economy, which suggests that we should actually interact with the foreign ones. It was based on not on economics. The first time in which an economic theory which tries to justify why we need to need or need not to buy and sell with foreign countries emerged only in the early 70s and 19th centuries. So the first theory that we had, which truly bases on economic reasons as to why we should or should not trade with foreign nations, is what we call the mercantilism or the mercantilist theory. The mercantilist theory is not per se against economic activities or against trading with countries. Yes, we should trade. But what they say is the countries should discourage import and encourage export. So when you look into the tenets of the mercantilism theory, you can say it's a theory that countries should discourage imports and encourage exports. Discourage imports and encourage exports. We need to look at what was happening at the time of the development of this theory to understand why they come to this conclusion or this kind of assumption. Yes, there was trading activity, mainly conducted either through barters. So when we evaluate, or when the wealth of a country was evaluated back then, it depends on how much of a gold reserve the country has. So that means the more gold reserve the country has, it's considered obviously as a wealthy country. Then, of course, it can control over other things. So when you have more gold reserves, you will be powerful, you will be wealthy as a state. Where do we get those gold reserves? We sell our things, because the means of, or the medium of transaction back then was gold. To buy a particular commodity that we need, we have to pay or effect payment using gold as a means of, as a medium of transaction. So that means when you export more, when you sell more, you get a lot of gold. So the government can have a gold reserve. Then the government can be wealthy. Then your country can be powerful. Right? Whereas if you import, then That means you have to pay for the things that you're buying, the things that you're getting from another country, then you're losing the gold reserve that you have. That means your dominance, your power would somehow be up. So that was at this time that the mercantilism theory was developed, where the wealth of countries was evaluated based on the gold reserves that the countries have. So what they say is, yes, we need to transact, we need to buy, we need to sell rather. Of course, as much as possible, we need to limit the amount of import to the minimum. So to do that, what they have proposed is certain measures, like, for example, to discourage imports, we introduce duties, tariffs. When a particular item is imported, the importer has to pay an extra amount, an import. That way, you can discourage the importer from buying those things. And to encourage exports, they suggest that we need to subsidize the exports. We need to support, we need to give some money for those who produce a particular thing and export their products. So, in order to maintain a favorable balance of trade, in order to make sure that the exports are better than the imports, they have suggested that we need to introduce some measures which would encourage exports, the export performance of the traders, and which would discourage importation of products, particularly with regard to raw materials. We need to discourage the importation of raw materials because they are available within the presumably available there. So we need to put some duties, additional taxes for those things that are going to be imported. So that was, in general, the tenet of the mercantilism theory. Yes, it's okay to trade, but as a government, the government should discourage imports and encourage exports using different economic instruments. To encourage exports, give them subsidies, give them supports for the exporters, and to discourage the imports, introduce those duties. Then, as you can imagine, if you just say that exporting is good, every country would be interested in exporting. So ultimately, you will not have anyone interested in buying, especially if countries are collecting and having this gold. At some point, you have a problem or a shortage with which to effect payment. So later on, it was discovered that this cannot make sense. It cannot sustain the system in a particular country. You cannot just encourage every country to export, because ultimately there should be a country that there would be a country which needs to import. So we need to have the theorists back then. They were very much concerned on what kind of economic theory they can develop to make sure or to somehow convince countries that trading, buying is also to their advantage, or something which is important and needs to be done. That's where we have Adam Smith coming up with a theory which was called an absolute advantage. He wrote a book in 1776, which is titled The Wealth of Nations, in which he argued that it's actually to the benefit of countries to trade with each other, to trade on, to buy things in which they have an absolute advantage of producing, and sell things in which they have an absolute advantage of producing, and buy products to which they do not have an absolute advantage in producing. So, for example, you can let's look at an example to better illustrate this absolute advantage theory. So let's say we have two countries, the US and India. It can also be other countries. Of course, there are certain factors which, as economists, Adam Smith has assumed, like we have only two countries in the world, and the two countries can produce only two things. Labor is uniform, the cost of labor is the same. Those assumptions that economists are made normally when they come up with theories are made in this absolute advantage theory as well. So we have only two countries in this world. This is the US and India, and there are two products that they can produce, only two products. And labor is the same in terms of its cost, in terms of several factors. So, and then the two products that they are making, let's have a machine, a particular kind of machine, and a piece of some clothes. When ልብስ ልንሰራበት የምንችለው ጣቃጫ ማለት ነው። ማምረት የሚችሉት እነዚህ ሁለቱ ፕሮዳክቶች ናቸው። So, one person per day in the US can make 5 machines. It can be a very small one, which is not complicated, which takes a longer period of time. So let's say in the US, the labor that they had can produce 5 machines within a day. And they can make 10 years of that same person. If the person, that labor, was given the option of making the clothes, what he can or she can make is 10 years of clothes per day. And then in India, on the other hand, the single labor makes within a single day 2 machines and the 15 yards of clothes. So within a single day, when we compare the labor in terms of its productivity for making a machine, the labor in US makes 5, whereas the labor in India makes 2. Whereas comparing the labor that we have in US and India with respect to the making of clothes, the one in the US makes 10, and the one in India makes 15. So that means, with regard to making clothes, the Indian labor has an absolute advantage over the labor in the US. Whereas, with regard to making machine, the labor in US has an absolute advantage in making machine over the labor in India. So Adam Smith, showing this, concluded that it will be to the advantage of the US to just keep on making machine and sell the machine to the Indians, and it will be advantageous for the Indians to make only clothes and sell the clothes while buying the machine from the US, because they have the absolute advantage of making those things over the other. So that's how we try to justify as to why we need to have to have a trade between the two nations. Clear now? Yeah. This is clear. So yes, when you have a country which has an absolute advantage over another with regard to a particular thing but not other things, this theory will work. Okay. Of course, it makes sense. If I can make, if I have an absolute advantage in making this paper over my neighbor, then why would it would be good for me if I sell this and buy something which I do not have an absolute advantage of. But then there are other instances, like what if a particular country has an absolute advantage in producing all of the things over the other country? The theory devised by Adam Smith cannot reply or that cannot give an answer to these questions. That's particularly what was happening in earlier times with regard to Britain, where Britain had a colony almost across all the world. I mean, how would the country have an absolute advantage over a particular thing or making a particular thing? Obviously depends on the resources that the country has. The knowledge that and the skill that the persons that are working on those things have over the other. So, looking into the experience of the UK, what you end up having is it has colonies across all countries or on all of the world. Then it can, through its colonies, it can have an absolute advantage over countries, almost over everything. If you have a colony of a country that produces which is rich in natural resources like in oil and gas, then you just use the oil that you have. You have a colony which is rich in diamonds, then you use that. Cacao, you use that. You don't have to buy cacao from another country. You just use your own cacao and produce your chocolate, and so on. So there's no reason for Britain to engage in according to this theory, according to the absolute advantage theory. There was no reason for Britain to engage in international trade with countries which are not its colonies. So then, looking into the shortcomings of Adam Smith's absolute advantage theory, another British economist came up with a theory which tries to justify why even countries that have absolute advantage over producing a particular thing should trade with the other countries. That's what we call the comparative advantage, which was devised by David Rippon. So he started to build on the theory developed by Adam Smith. Okay, yes, if a country has an absolute advantage over another country, then we can accept that as a reason as to why this country should trade with another one. But what if the country does not have, what if a country has an absolute advantage in everything? Then what would be the reason for that country to produce with another country? So we just took, for example, we can take two countries. Let's just change it for a while, and we have Poland on one hand, and we have England on the other hand. And let's say, at least for the fun of it, let's assume that we have wine and clothes again. Poland, it needs 80 people to produce a particular quantity of wine in Poland. Whereas to produce a particular amount of or quantity of lengths of clothes, it needs 90 labor. Whereas in England, that same amount of wine can be produced using 120 labor, unit of labor, and producing that same amount of clothes would need 100 units of labor in England. So if you just simply look at that, 100 That means, let's say, wine per, I don't know, per how many 100 gallons of oil, I don't know, gallon selling soup. And to make 1,000 yards of clothes. To make 100 gallons of wine, it needs 80 units of labor in Poland. Whereas it needs 90 units of labor to make a clothes, the 1,000 yards of clothes in Poland. And when we compare that with the figure in England, the labor that you need to produce the 100 gallons of wine is 120 people or 120 units of labor. Whereas for the clothes, what you have is what you need is 100. In terms of looking into the cost that you're going to incur for the labor, what you have is Poland has an absolute advantage in both circumstances, in producing both the wine and the clothes. Because it can make the same amount of wine with less labor compared to England. The same for the clothes as well. It can make the same amount of, or the same length of clothes with lesser labor costs, with lesser amount of people involved. So that means there is no reason for Poland to trade with England if you look at the absolute advantage, if you just based on absolute advantage each year. But what David Ricardo says is, yes, this country, Poland has an absolute advantage over England. But then, look at that. When you look at the difference between the two, between making, in terms of the labor cost for making wine, the difference here is, for Poland, it needs 80 labor, whereas for England it's 120. So, it would be easier, or even, it would make sense. Yes, for England, the labor cost in making clothes is higher, but when you compare what Poland is going to incur in making wine and clothes, comparison አደረጋቸው ሁለቱም ግን more advantages, better advantage የሚኖረው Poland is if it specializes in producing wine, selling wine, and buying the clothes, because the labor that we have, the difference, we have a 10 unit of labor extra in making the clothes. Comparing the same country producing two different clothes. Or maybe a simple thing that we can relate to would be, let's assume that after you graduate, you become a practicing lawyer, you know how to type matter into Latin. So let's say per hour, or I don't know, but type matter let's say, and the per type matter let's say band basically cost and document produce matter as lawyers, we charge our clients, let's say $200 per hour. So we can plus ክላይንቶቻችንን ደግሞ በሰዓት 200 ብር መቻል የምናውቀው ብለን እናስብ። ጸሐፊ ቀጥረናል። ጸሐፊያችን አንድ ዶክመንት ታይፕ ለማድረግ 30 ደቂቃ ይፈጅበታል ብለን እናስብ። ለጸሐፊያችን የምንከፍለው ገንዘብ ደግሞ let's say 50 ብር ነው በሰዓት። So, እሱ ሌጋል አድቫይስ መስጠት አይችልም። You have an absolute advantage over this person. Okay? You can type faster than him. You can give a legal service or an advice for clients, so you have an absolute advantage in those things. But would it make sense to hire this person as your secretary? Yes. Why? Then another angle to look at the issue would also be what? The cost that we're going to incur. Okay. We're charging our clients 200 per hour. And we're paying for the secretary 30 or whatever, which is less than what we're earning per hour. So yes, let's say when I'm sat in the middle of selling and document ለማድረስ አንድ ሰዓት ይፈጅብናል ለአገር ጸሐፊያችን ሁለት ሰዓት ይፈጅበታል ያንን ዶክመንት ለማድረስ still how much are we going to pay this person 30 ብር ነው እየከፈልን ያለነው አይደል 60 ብር ብቻ ነው ኮስት የሚያደርግልን እኛ ያንን ሰው ለመጣራቸው ሁለት ሰዓት እኛ ግን ብንሰራ only giving the legal advice for our clients, how much are we going to earn? 400. So obviously, yes, we have an absolute advantage over our clients in both giving the legal advice as well as giving our typing, producing our documents. But it makes sense for us to hire a secretary, this secretary, because ultimately what we're paying him is much lower or much lesser than what we're going to earn or what we would have earned if we just specialize on giving a legal service for our clients, because we're charging 200 per hour as opposed to what we're paying for this person. So the same kind of theory is what we have here. Okay. It would make sense for Poland to just specialize on producing wines, because the cost of producing or the amount of labor that it is to produce wine is lesser compared to making clothes. Yes, it has a comparative advantage on those things, but it would make sense for this country to specialize on making the product over which it has a comparative advantage of, which costs lesser for it in making that product. We can also think of the example of a tailor and a shoemaker. Let's say the tailor knows how to make, of course, as a tailor knows how to make outfits. And let's assume that he also can make shoes, but not as perfectly or as efficiently as the shoemaker, who has also the ability to make both clothes and shoes, as their name indicates. But when you look into the cost that it could take each of this persons to make the different items, as a tailor, the tailor can make the outfit, the clothes, within a short period of time because he's an expert on that. But making the shoe would take this person a longer. Yes, he can make the shoe, but making that shoe would take him a longer period of time compared to what it would have taken the shoemaker to produce that shoe. So it would make sense for the tailor to just specialize on making the clothes and sell those clothes, and buy the shoe from the shoemaker, who has a comparative advantage in terms of the cost, in terms of the time that it will take him, and so on, to produce those shoes. So, yes, someone can have an absolute advantage over another in terms of producing, or some country rather, can have an absolute advantage in terms of producing a particular thing, but the comparative advantage could lie only on a particular thing, and that could be a result of the resource endowment that the countries have. It can be because of it could make sense, particularly if we're talking about products that would relate to or based on the resources that we have. Anyways, that's the basic line of comparative advantage theory. Clear now? This is basically the fundamental reason. Yes, there are other theories which were developed after that. Okay? It's more of a refining of the theory. But if you ask anyone as to why countries trade with each other, what you find as as a reason, an answer is the comparative advantage. Countries do not have the same kind of comparative advantage in everything. Okay? So we say that we have land, abundant land, which is very rich in different things which can be tilled, and so we can claim that we can have an absolute a comparative advantage in agricultural products. So we sell our agricultural products and we buy, for example, the oil. Because we don't have oil, we need oil. We import oil from the Gulf countries and we sell our agricultural products from those countries. Probably we recently have started in exploration of oil, but we cannot yet claim to have a comparative advantage over the production of oil in this country. So we still, based on the difference in natural endowments that we have, or the natural resources, the difference in that we base on comparative advantage to justify as to why countries trade with each other. So as a kind of a modification, or rather refinement to this comparative advantage theory, more of a recent theory that we have is what we call the factor proportion hypothesis. ይሄን ራሱ ፋክተር ፕሮፖርሽን ሃይፖቴሲስ የምንለው ከየት ነው የሚጀምረው? ቤዝ የሚያደርገው ኮምፓራቲቭ አድቫንቴጅ ኦፍ ይኖረናል አለ። ነገር ግን ዋት ኢፍ ብለው ሌሎች ሴናሪዎችን መፍጠር አይነት ነገር ነው። ዋት ኢፍ like in the case of the clause in wine, what if clause making is, of course, as it is, labor intensive, and wine making is land intensive. So it's not just the labor that's going to matter here. Absolute advantage, like comparative advantage, like the assumption የተወሰኑት ነገሮች ሁለት ሀገራቶች ናቸው ያሉን ምንድነው ሌበር ሲሚላር ነው ሌበር ኢዝ አን ኢምፖርታንት ፋክተር የሚሉትን ነገሮች አካውንት ወስዶ ዴቨሎፕ ይደረጋሉ። ዋት ኢፍ ሌበር ብቻውን ፋክተር ማለት ነው? ለምሳሌ ያንን ጣቃጨርቅ መስራት ኦፍኮርስ ሌበር ኢንቴንሲቭ ነገር ነው። ዋይን ለመስራት መጀመሪያ ወይኑን ማብቀል አለብን። ወይኑን ካበቀልን በኋላ ወደ ወይን ጠጅነት የምንቀይረው ኦፍኮርስ ለዛ ደግሞ ለአንድ መሬት ያስፈልገናል። መሬት ላይ ነው የምናበቅለው። ሶ ኢት ኒድስ the production of wine ultimately needs or it's a land intensive endeavor. So yes, according to the factor proportion hypothesis theory, what it says is countries will tend to enjoy comparative advantage in producing goods that they use their more abundant factors more intensively. So the factors of production have an impact on the enjoyment of comparative advantage. If we have abundant labor, then it would mean our comparative advantage lies on things that require labor, intensive labor in producing, in making. If the abundant resource that we have is not labor, instead the land that we have. So our comparative advantage lies on making or producing things that use or that need an extensive plan. So, as I said earlier, it's a more of a refinement of the comparative advantage theory, where these theorists say that countries can make use of, or they can enjoy comparative advantage in producing the products, the goods, which use their more or most abundant factors more intensively. So, ሀብታችን መሬት ነው ብለን የምናስብ ከሆነ ፈርታይል መሬት የምንል ከሆነ መሬቱን ያለን ያ ፕሮፖርሽናሊ ኮምፔር ስናደርገው ከሌበር ወይም ከተለያየ ነገር ጋር ኮምፔር ስናደርገው ሞር አድቫንቴጅ ያለን እዛ ላይ ነው ካለን መሬቱን ተጠቅመን ማልማትና ከዛ ላይ የምናገኘውን መሸጥ መቀየር ይላል would be advantageous to us, or comparative advantage መጠቀም. So that means you could need to assess, to evaluate where our comparative advantage lies. So the factor proportion theory, as a continuation of what we have as a comparative advantage, says that countries should utilize or identify where their comparative advantage lie, and they can make use of that by emphasizing or by making use of the factor production that they have a comparative advantage of. Of course, the explanation and so on was somehow confined to the agricultural sector. More factor production that's not defined, explains that again more. ከሪሶርስ እና ከላንድ ጋር ዳይመንድ አለ። ስለዚህ ዳይመንድን ኤክስፕሎር ማድረግ ከመሬት ውስጥ ማውጣት ዳይመንዶችን በተለያየ ቅርጻቅርጽነት ወራቴበር አውጥተን መጠቀም መቻል would be ብዙ የዳይመንድ ሪዘርቭ ላለው would be to our advantage. ስለዚህ factor proportion ሀይፖቴሲስ ምንድን ነው የሚለን should emphasize on that to comparative advantage የት ነው ላይ የሚያደርገው አለብን የሚለውን አይደንቲፋይ አድርገን እዛ ኤሪያ ላይ ፎከስ አድርገን መስራት አለብን። But it limits itself or limited itself to natural resources, to land and so on related things. ስለዚህ ወደ ፋርሚንግ ጋር ሪሶርስ አለን ወይ ነዳጅ አለን ወይ ወርቅ እንቁ ዋቴቨር አለን ወይ ወደሚለው ነው የሚወስደን ማለት ነው። It doesn't explain industrialization. On what basis should a country specialize on industries, producing a particular level or a particular industrial product? Explain another, which again is also a continuation of the comparative advantage. Sorry, is product cycle. The product cycle theory on international trade. ምንድን ነው የጀነራል ፕሮዳክት cycle theory የሚያደርገው ስንል it tries to explain specialization or patterns of international specialization in the manufacturing sector. Why would a particular country specialize on manufacturing a particular thing, and why would the other specialize on another particular industrial product የሚለውን ነገር ነው ዲፋይን ለማድረግ ኤክስፕሌን ለማድረግ ነው የሚሞክረው ማለት ነው። So back then, like when this theory was developed, there were certain countries which were pioneer, like the US, and highly developed and industrialized countries. Japan was not there yet, which although those industrial economies, those countries had a kind of superior access to financial capital and specialized form of human capital because of the skill, the training that they have. So based on looking into that, what they have developed is those countries the skill, the financial capital, and so on should specialize on producing some aspect of the product, some level of the production of particular good should be maintained in that country. Of course, there are certain stages which were developed, which were explained in this product cycle theory. So, ሲጀምር የሆነ እነዚህ ፋይናንሻል እና ስኪል ያላቸው ኢንዱስትሪያላይዝድ የሆኑ ሀገራቶች particularly focused was on the US basically. እነዚህ ሀገራቶች ለምሳሌ ያህል some part of the computer process መስራት ሊሆን ይችላል። እዛ ጋር ቢካሄድ ይሻላል። Better than the others who do not have the human capacity, the skill to produce those things and do not have the financial capacity as well to make that. So, መጀመሪያ እዛው ለዶሜስቲክ ማርኬቱ መስራት መጀመር ስፔሻላይዝ አድርጎ መስራት መጀመር then እያለ ወደ ሌላ ሀገር ሰርቶ መሸጥን even at the last stage of your product cycle የመጨረሻው ስቴጅ ላይ ሲደርስ እንደሚለው ካምፓኒዎች ሌላ ሀገርም ሪሎኬት አድርገው ስኪል ትራንስፈር ተደርጎ ወደ ሌላ ሀገርም ሌላ ቦታ ላይ ከኬዝ ኦፍ the multinational corporations ማለት ነው እዛ ፕሮዲውስ ተደርጎ ኢቨን ፕሮዲውስ የተደረገው እቃ ወደ ኦሪጂን ወደ መጀመሪያ ላይ ሲመረት የነበረው ሀገር ኤክስፖርት የሚደረግበትን ሲናሪዮ ኢንቪዜጅ የሚያደርገው ማለት ነው። So this is more confined on manufacturing than the manufacturing sector. And of course, the assumption is that to make use of the comparative advantage with regard to the manufacturing sector, we need to look at the skills that are existent in a particular state and the financial, whether the country has a financial capacity. So if you do not have the skill or the financial capacity, at least the beginning stages of the product cycle theory would not materialize. Okay. ወደ ላስት ስቴጅ ጋር ስንመጣ ያለው ሊያመጣልን ይችላል። ወዛ ኢንቨስት አድርገው ኢንቨስት ከተደረገ በኋላ ኦፍ ኮርስ ከኢንቨስትመንት ጋር ተያይዞ ስኪል ትራንስፈር ስለሚኖር ሌሎች ሀገራቶችም ላይ ይሆናል። So in this, so with the short answer, if you are asked as to why countries trade with each other, what you have to say is just simply comparative advantage. Because countries do not have the same comparative advantage on everything. They have difference in the natural resources that they have, in factors that affect the production and so on of products. Then that means they need to trade with each other. The other that come after that, the factor proportion and the product cycle theories are more of a continuation, a refinement of the individual handles of comparative arrangements. Any questions? Is it clear? Yes. When I start discussing about the absolute advantage, I said there are certain factors that are considered as constant. Constant እንዳስቀምጣቸው. There are only two countries here in Europe. Two countries. There are only two products. There are only these things. The same kind of skill ያላቸው ናቸው. The same kind of እንትን ያላቸው ናቸው. እያልን ነው ይሄን ያለው ማለት ነው. So it doesn't to come up with a particular theory. Then at least in terms of economics, you have to provide certain constants. These are the constants. So that doesn't happen.
Is demand also
sufficient demand is not a reason not to trade. Okay, it may lessen the amount of trade that you have. But as I said, we're saying that there are only two products in this world. For that matter, the products could be injera and I don't know, beer or whatever. Okay, so these are the two products that you have in the world. The essence is that, of course, these are the two products that each of the societies need. They are making, both countries are making the same thing because these are the two products that they need for their sustenance. The products can be different. Any other question? Okay, then the next thing will be, now we we know why countries trade with each other. The next question would be, should trade be free within them? So we need to discourage imports, so we impose duties. We need to encourage export, so let's introduce subsidies and so on. So where are we now in terms of that? Countries still use duties, imports, but there is a debate on whether there is a need to remove tariffs and a need to remove subsidies. So the next thing that we do will be to see the free trade debate. Okay? The question is not about should countries trade with each other. Yes, it is. I mean, it's confirmed through time that countries do actually need to trade with each other. But the question is, should the trade be free trade? That would be the point of discussion for our next class.